Welcome back to episode 2 in my 10-part series of how to make a full body 2D VTuber model for beginners. Last episode, we went over why learning the basics of Live2D is so important. We also talked about how much you should charge for a Live2D model if you do decide to do commissions and sell your work. Everything that we'll be learning in this tutorial is going to help you with learning how to animate a tier 1 VTuber character. And we also discussed additional tips that I wish I knew before starting Live2D Cubism. If you missed the last episode, I highly recommend going back to check out some of the content before moving on to this episode. In this episode, we'll be going over everything you should know to prepare your PSD file, or in other words, prepare your character for Live2D Cubism. First, we'll learn how to set up our canvas, as well as the best canvas settings. And then we'll talk about additional important information that you should keep in mind when making a character for Live2D Cubism, as well as what to keep an eye out for if you are only the rigger and rigging another artist's work. Also, I did want to mention, if you've not seen it, I do have a discount code for Live2D Cubism in the description below, as well as in the pinned comment, so make sure you use that once you decide to download Live2D, which we will be downloading together in the next episode. Alright, let's hop into it. Now let's start off with talking about our canvas size. What canvas size should you use before you decide to start drawing your character? If we take a look at my canvas size, mine is 6,164 pixels by 10,795 pixels. Now, if we switch this to inches, that's going to be 20 by 35. I like to compare this to thinking about a printer size piece of paper, which is 8.5 inches by 11.5. We want to make our canvas and our work much bigger, because you might be zooming into your VTuber while streaming or zooming close up to your character while talking to your community. And we don't want it to look super pixelated, which this is what it would look like if it were on a smaller sized canvas. So try to get a pretty big piece of paper. Think about it as like you want a massive piece of paper so that any type of zooming in is going to continue to make it look crystal clear. Now, the other thing to look at is the resolution. What is our resolution? Now, typically 300 resolution, or another word for it is DPI. Resolution / DPI. 72 is pretty standard for anything that's going to be done digitally. However, 300 is really important if your work is going to be printed. For example, if you are deciding that you want to sell merch or something along those lines in the future and reuse this artwork for that, you're definitely going to want to make sure it's at 300 DPI or 300 resolution. There's even printing places who actually print far beyond this quality, so if you decide to make merch or anything like that in the future, make sure you check into those printing specs for that company. Now, I do 300 even though I'm not necessarily going to be printing this, just to be safe. There's no reason really why you don't need to use 300 unless you're trying to save space on your computer, but I think best practice is just continuing to use 300 DPI as a minimum. Next, let's talk about the complexity of your character. How complex should you draw your character? You'll see models that from simple anime models to something that's a lot more complex. Now, I want to talk about 3 different levels of complexity that it can kind of be broken down into with modeling. Let's take a look at an example like Rize from Tokyo Ghoul. Rize is a fairly simple design, and for most anime, you'll come across pretty simple designs because depending on how that anime was made, they may be doing hand-drawn animation or something that's going to be drawn frame by frame. Now, the advantage of Live2D Cubism is, since you're going to be rigging your model, you don't have to draw everything frame by frame, which means there's actually a lot of time saved with something like Live2D Cubism. However, the more complex you make your model, the more complex the drawing process will be and the layer separation will be, which we will dive into shortly. So Rize, as you can see, has very simple shading. It's very clear where the shading is, it's very clear where the highlights are, and it's very clear where her base is. And she doesn't really have a lot of complex nose shading or anything like that. If you look at a model like mine is a little bit more painterly. There's a few more strokes in the hair. There's just a little bit more of a painterly look on things like the bow right there. And even the nose, the bridge of the nose is a little bit more complex. And I even have cheeks that are shaded a little bit. This is going to make it out to be a more complex model depending on how I want it to be animated. Now let's look at something that's even more complex. For example, here is a piece of artwork that is anime-like, but very, very painterly. It's kind of a mix of realism and anime. What we're going to be doing is prepping our file so that it can be used for Live2D Cubism. What that means is every single piece is going to be separated into its own bit. This can get really complicated, as you can see with something like a complex piece of work, because there's a lot of overlap. We want it to be very clear what is each piece. So if we pull apart the lips, for example, we have the line art, the top lip, the bottom lip, the teeth. And when you pull apart the hair, I have the hair broken into sections like this, and you could get even more advanced by separating things like the line art and the highlights, so that this piece of hair would actually be separated into something like 3 different chunks. If you were to do a piece like this, it could get pretty insane pretty quickly, because you're going to want to be separating all these different layers. It's not impossible, but it's definitely going to take you a lot more time, and I don't recommend it if you are a beginner to Live2D Cubism. The best place to start would be doing something very simple like this Rize model, or if you are pretty comfortable with painting and drawing and you know a little bit already about animation, you might be okay to start somewhere in between, kind of how my work is like. Next, let's talk about the actual different layers in and of themselves. So every layer really should be separated. When you're going to draw your character, you can draw it all as one painting or one illustration or with a few layers, but eventually you're going to want to separate it into several layers. So you can see how many crazy layers I have here. It gets quite insane because you'll be separating every single piece, right? I'm not going to go through every single piece in this video, but I do have a playlist of all the breakdowns I did for this specific model, and if you're wanting to dive more into that and understand that more deeply, I'll leave a link to that playlist below and what that looks like. So there are 2 different ways you could essentially approach the way you're drawing your character. The first way that you could approach drawing your character is starting off with, okay, I understand that this is all going to be separated. So I'm going to draw the line art, that's going to be one layer. Then I'm going to draw the base hair, that's going to be another layer. Then the shadows, then the highlights, and all those would be on separate layers. Now that's one way you can do it. For me, I like to get really painterly and lost in my paintings. So I actually draw my whole character without worrying too much about the layer separation. I actually do that literally at the end. So I'll spend like hours at the end cleaning up layers and separating everything with something called the lasso tool in Photoshop, where I'll lasso it and then I'll take it and I'll put it onto its own layer. That's what I like to do. Now that could be a lot more time consuming. Some people argue that's not a good way to do it. Some people love that way of doing it. You got to find truly what works best for you. There is no right or wrong answer. It's truly what's going to be the best for you depending on the situation you're in. Now for naming your layers, something that's super important to keep in mind is we want to name things according to the characters left and right. So for me, if I'm looking at my computer screen, this is the right eyebrow. I would see this as being the right eyebrow, and I would see this as being the left eyebrow. However, when you're preparing a model for Live2D Cubism, you actually want to go according to the character's perspective. So if Syafire was turned around, this would be her right and this would be her left. So when you're naming your layers, you want them to be named on the character's perspective. So this is her right eyebrow, this is her left eyebrow. If you struggle to understand that concept, you could think of something like Minecraft. If we were to draw a little box right here, and you know how you have your little block hands while you're playing Minecraft, we're from the perspective of the character. So the rest of the character's body would be here, your head would be here, kind of like how you're playing on your computer or playing on your PC. So the right is going to be, it's whatever direction the character is facing. Hopefully that can help make you understand a little bit better which side would be which. So for example, this is actually going to be the right gem, even though it's technically my left when I look at the screen. Next, let's talk about when you actually are separating your layers. We want to separate things into parts. So you'll want to have a front, a middle, and a back, because we are trying to sell the fact that this is 3D work even though it's a 2D illustration. So if we take a look at another model that I worked on, here's an example of front, back, middle. So here's the front sleeve. This would kind of be a number 1. Here is the middle, which would be the number 2, and then here is the back, which is 3, and you can see how it stays behind the hand. We have 1, and then we have 2, and then we have 3. You want to separate everything to kind of have a front layer, middle layer, and a back layer. So that's a really good basic understanding to have. Something else to look at is you can get really complex with it, where this lace could either exist all together, like the shading, the mane, and the line art could just be one layer, or you can actually separate it. I have the base and the shading on one layer, and I have the line art on another layer for more control. The more you separate your layers, the more control you'll have. So of course, I could have all this merged and just have this whole bottom skirt, and then I would be bending this whole piece together. But what would happen is these frills might start looking a little weird as they bend. So the more that you can separate everything, the better it will be. So do you separate line art? You know, that's a common question. How much control do you want to have? You can, but you also don't have to. Here's another good example of kind of a front, behind, and middle. This back of the wing is super far behind. This is a middle piece because this wing is bending over, and then the wing is the front, but this is also separated into several sections because this wing is a little bit more complicated where the joints are going to be bending as it flaps. So that one gets a little bit complicated. And of course, if you have questions referring to your specific character, feel free to drop by our Discord and ask questions in the question section. Everyone's really helpful there. I know that this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all tutorial because we all have different characters. We have like orcs, we have wolf girls, we have ghouls, we all have crazy stuff that's going to be different. Now, this brings me to my next point, which is drawing the unseen. I call this the drawing the unseen rule, which is going to be what can you usually not see if you're drawing a straight illustration. I like to use the rotate tool in Photoshop to see what would the action of that thing be in order to help me understand how much of it I should be drawing. So for example, this bow, if you were drawing traditional illustration, you would only draw the edges of it because you don't need to draw anything behind. But if you're preparing it for animation in Live2D Cubism, you may want to draw the whole bow. You wouldn't have known that that whole thing is back there. You even want to draw the pieces that are going to be dangling, for example. So it still doesn't stop here. I still have this full piece of bow because the bow might be dangling this way or that way as it moves in the wind. So again, I like to use the rotate tool to kind of see and predict like what is the movement of this item. So really try to think practically of how would this thing move in the real world and how can I apply that to my character. I'll do that with hair too. So if I know the hair is going to be swinging back and forth, let's see what we're going to need to draw and how much of it we're going to need to draw, right? So that's really helpful there. Here's another example. If we pull away the gem, you can see, oh, that piece of the necklace is still there. If you're wanting to do something like toggleable items, you'll want to separate that as well. So this shirt is separated into several pieces, but also I can take the sweater off so that she only has this little tank top, which can be easily done in Live2D Cubism with something called a toggle, where it's kind of like flipping a light switch on and off. The sweater's on or the sweater's off. Very simple to do. So that's something if you're interested in doing more clothes for your character. Here's another example where we wouldn't think the whole gem would be there, but it is because as her bangs start to rotate, we might see more of that gem being revealed. So very important to draw the unseen and draw as much as you can. Now again, for any additional layer separation, understanding things like the eyelids and stuff like that, that playlist will be below for you to check out and do an even deeper dive of how I broke down this whole model. Now let's take a look at a few more examples. Here is the whole hair, where I'm drawing more of the unseen once more. Here's a bow, and we still have the other pieces of the dress under there. These are all separate pieces. So hopefully this is starting to make sense as I pull stuff apart for you to really start understanding how it all works. If you're planning to do anything like emotes, it's going to work very similarly to clothes, where it's going to be like a light switch toggling on and off. So if you have something like blush that you want to toggle on and off, just make sure it's on its own layer so we can turn it on and off with the light switch mechanic. Now let's talk about dirty pixels. I'm somebody who really enjoys getting in there and really doing a nice painterly look to a character. The problem with this is sometimes I'll have my artwork kind of be all over the place, where there might be some stray pixels that are over here on the side of the canvas because maybe I just didn't clean up that paint or whatever the case may be. That will be an issue for us later when we're mapping textures. I know that term might be confusing right now, but we'll talk about it in the next episode. Just make sure that everything is cleaned up and very specific to its own zone. I like to click Ctrl-T on my keyboard to see where the bounds are on my work if I decide to take the route of separating my artwork later and not at the very beginning. Now, if you have other pieces around here, when I click Ctrl-T, you can see how my bounding box is a little further out. You want to make sure everything's cleaned up and ready to go for Live2D Cubism. And as another important note, let's talk about different layer effects. There are 3 layer effects that is acceptable for Live2D Cubism, but it still sometimes has a hard time understanding that. So we're going to take this piece of hair, for example, so I can show you the 3. There is the normal layer mode, which is just the default layer mode that we draw on right here. Next, there is going to be the additive, which is usually something that you might use if you want to add highlights to your work. You can see how bright that is. If I was using it in a more practical way, I'd probably turn down the opacity and be painting it over, like painting the highlights. And that's going to be our linear dodge additive. And then lastly is going to be our multiply layer mode, which is usually used for shading. You might just end up doing your own shading, but that's the other layer mode that is acceptable. So usually a way that you can think about it is normal, light, dark. So kind of like normal color, highlights, shading. So if I were to go in here with my multiply layer and start laying this on top, you can see how it's painting it to be kind of darker. These are the only layers that are acceptable for Live2D Cubism, which I'd still recommend merging the layers if you can. So what merging is if I had this as a highlight with the linear dodge on top of my hair, I would want to right click the layer and click merge down. You might lose some of your effects, so that can be dangerous sometimes as well. But there are layers in Live2D Cubism as well that lets you kind of turn those modes on, which we'll talk about again later. And you can go back into your Photoshop file and adjust stuff later. So don't worry about like it has to be perfect in Photoshop on the first go, because we'll be able to re-import easily into Live2D Cubism if you're adding anything new, like clothing items or a necklace or something like that. So the best tip that I could really give you is really try to understand mechanically how something would be moving in space as if it were 3D. That would be the best logic I could give you to follow when drawing anything and preparing your model for Live2D Cubism. Those are a ton of tips I have for the preparation of a 2D character and model. I didn't go super into the drawing end of things because again, this is sort of a build up to what we'll truly be learning step by step, which is Live2D Cubism. Hopefully those tips were super duper helpful for you. In the next episode, we'll be going over how to set your character up in Live2D Cubism, arranging the layers, learning about drawing orders, as well as texture atlasing. And if all these terms are super confusing right now, don't worry, because I will guide you through and teach you how these all work. Thank you so much for joining me on the Syafire Star, and I'll see you next time. Bye!